talking about the egoic self versus the real self, the soul, the divine image, who we really are. And I talk about this a lot because it's an essential theme in the spiritual life. It's one of the foundation stones. So let me just say this. As long as we live from the ego, and I'm not demonizing the ego, it's just very, very limited. As long as we live from the egoic personality, we are living from a mistaken identity. The ego is always communicating to us at some level who we are and what we are, and it is always inaccurate, always. Who we are can never be captured in a word or a thought. Now, because we're human beings, we have to use words and we have to use concepts, but who we are is beyond concepts, just like God is beyond any concept. So I have two readings tonight. One is from the New Testament, and a little bit later, one from the autobiography of a yogi. And as I read this first reading, you might be saying, what in God's name does that have to do with the real self and the ego? Just stay with me. Okay. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he questioned his disciples. Who do you say the Son of Man is? And the Son of Man is referring to himself. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others say one of the prophets. Or instead, some simply say one of the prophets. And then Jesus said, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Messiah meaning anointed one. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you, Peter, are this rock, and I will build my church on it. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised up to life. Now Peter, who he had just said all these wonderful things to, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Quote, far be it from you, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Again, I want you to get the contrast, what he had just said to Peter and what he says to Peter now, and I will explain it. But Jesus turned to him and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are a stumbling block to me. For you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. All right, so again, you may be saying, please, what does that have to do with self-realization? But I want you to see that this story is about us. All the gospel stories and all of the truly manifestations of religious literature in the valid sense of that, they're all about us. They're our stories. So Jesus is asking his disciples, and you can tell he's reflected on them, on this question himself, who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? Part of the spiritual life is wrestling with that question of who do I say I am? Who do other people say I am? And who does God say I am? Francis of Assisi would sometimes spend all night saying this prayer mantra. Oh Lord, who am I that you would be mindful of me? Who am I? So this question of who am I, it's not just a question about Jesus' identity, it's a question about each one of our identities. Carl Jung said that Jesus is the archetype of the soul. So what he wrestled with, we wrestled with. The questions that he asked about himself, we have to ask about ourselves. You get that so far? Do you see how this is different than what most of us think? All right, second piece. The answers he gets at first are opinions. Well, some say you're the prophet Elijah, come back. Some say you're Jeremiah, come back. And some just say generically you're one of the prophets. He's not getting anything inspired there. He's getting mere opinion. Now, what does that have to do with you and me? Well, some of us look to Fox News or CNN for the truth. You ain't going to get it. Some of you may look to your therapist, and I'm going to qualify this because, I masquerade as a psychotherapist in my day job. Okay? Ultimately, your therapist can't tell you who you are. They can tell you what's going on at the level of your ego and your unconscious, but your therapist can't give you a diagnosis that can tell you who you are because you transcend the diagnosis. Even your mother can't really tell you who you are per se. And your ego can't tell you who you are. You with me so far? So it doesn't come from opinion. It doesn't come from the DSM-5 or 6, the diagnostic manual that therapists use. It doesn't come from the ego. Then Peter speaks and he says, you are the Christ, the anointed, the Son of God. And now notice what Jesus said. I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. Blessed are you, Simon, because flesh and blood has not revealed this. You didn't get this through CNN. You didn't get this through Fox News. You didn't get this through your therapist. You didn't get this through the court of public opinion. My Father in heaven revealed this to you. Who we are at the core has to come from above. Who we are at the core has to come from a transcendental source. Because we, in our deepest nature, we are transcendental. You've heard this saying many times. We're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. Therefore, it is only an enlightened consciousness. This is what he was saying to Peter. I'm translating it. It's only an enlightened consciousness. It's only a spiritual consciousness. It is only God consciousness that can really tell you who you are. Let me say it this way. I'm sure most of you believe that you have free will, right? I don't think you realize what a miracle free will is. Because what you're saying is there's something about you that transcends your biochemistry. There's something about you that transcends your genetic programming. There's something about you that transcends your psychological conditioning. You can only be free and have freedom because there's a part of you that transcends all the cause and effect laws that function on this plane. Ergo, you are a spiritual being that transcends all of this, made in the image of God. Does that make sense? All right. And then Jesus makes this outrageous statement. Peter, I'm paraphrasing, if you stay in that consciousness by which you knew who I really was, whatever you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. In heaven, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. The things that will happen in you and through you are beyond your comprehension. If you stay in that heightened state of consciousness. Because where Peter was speaking from, again, was not egoic consciousness. Where Peter was speaking from was God consciousness. He was speaking from the absolute. He was speaking from this universal divine plane. He was bringing heaven into earth. And as long as, and to the degree that we stay in that consciousness, miracles happen. Synchronicity happens all over the place, unendingly, as long as we stay in that consciousness. That's what Jesus was saying to him. You stay in that consciousness, the keys to the kingdom belong to you and potentially to us. You see what this is really about? Now there's one more piece, because this is us too. So Peter's in this exalted state of consciousness. Jesus says these wonderful things to him, and then Jesus says something that Peter doesn't like. It ignites his ego, and Peter falls back into egoic consciousness. So he's taking the guru, his teacher, aside and saying, no, you got it wrong. Let me explain it to you. And then what does Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan. He says, you're not speaking from the Spirit here. Now, it may sound cruel when he says, get behind me, Satan. In another place, Jesus defines Satan as what? The father of lies. What he's saying is, when you're in that lower consciousness, you don't know the truth. You can't see the truth, Peter. You don't understand it. You have to be in that higher plane to get the truth. Isn't that your experience? Don't you know when somebody's telling you the truth? And don't you know when somebody is bending reality? You feel it, you sense it, you know it. So we're like Peter. We have these moments of exaltation. Then we have this cycle down. And it's like we forget all of the sublime moments. We forget the realizations, and we fall into ego consciousness and we suffer. And then we start living a lie. We all go through that. The goal is to shorten those cycles, and so they happen less often and with less intensity. So then that begs the question, how do we do that? How do we stay in that higher state of consciousness? Now I'm going to go to Yogananda. This is from the autobiography. And this is an interaction between Yogananda and his guru Sri Yukteswar. We looked into each other's eyes, he and Sri Yukteswar, where tears were shining. A blissful wave engulfed me. He was in a higher state of consciousness, Yogananda was. I was conscious that the Lord, in the form of my guru, was expanding the small ardors of my heart into the vast reaches of cosmic love. And then Yogananda had a constriction, just like us. Now, he reached a certain point in his life where there were no more constrictions, but this is early on. A few mornings later, I made my way to Master's empty sitting room. I planned to meditate, but my laudable purpose was unshared by disobedient thoughts. His egoic mind kicked in and was running the show. They scattered like birds before the hunter. Now, Yogananda's name before he got the name Sri Yukteswar or Yogananda, when he became a monk, was Mukunda. So Sri Yukteswar calls to him, Mukunda, sounded from a distant balcony. Yogananda said, I felt as rebellious as my thoughts. So you can see he's constricting. His guru's knocking on the door and he's pretending he doesn't hear him. Master always urges me to meditate, I muttered to myself. He should not disturb me when he knows why I came into this room. That's the ego just kicking in. He summoned me again. I remained obstinately silent. The third time his tone held a rebuke, like, you better get here now. I'm not playing with you, sucker. Sir, I'm meditating, I shouted protestingly. I know you're meditating, my guru called out. With your mind disturbed like leaves in a storm, come here to me. Thwarted and exposed, I made my way sadly to his side. Poor boy, mountains cannot give you what you want. Master spoke caressingly, comfortingly. His calm gaze was unfathomable. Your heart's desire shall be fulfilled. And it was for God. Sri Yukteswar seldom indulged in riddles. I was bewildered. He struck gently on my chest, just above the heart. My body became immovably rooted. Breath was drawn out of my lungs as if by some huge magnet. Soul and mind instantly lost their physical bondage and streamed out like fluid, piercing light from my every pore. The flesh was as though dead, yet in my intense awareness, I knew that I had never been before more fully alive. My sense of identity was no longer narrowly confined to a body or his ego, but embraced the circumambient atoms. People on distant streets seemed to be moving gently over my own remote periphery. The roots of plants and trees appeared through a dim transparency of the soil. I discerned the inward flow of their sap, and if you read the autobiography, he goes on and on. He was given an experience of cosmic consciousness. He kept on expanding beyond consciousness, beyond the world, beyond creation, into pure, unfettered union with the divine. But he couldn't do it on his own. The trap that we fall into in the spiritual life is we think that we can overcome the ego. We think that, and really when we think that we can overcome the ego, it's just the ego trying to overcome itself, which it knows what it's doing, and it knows that it can't happen. I've told this story before many, many years ago, early in my teaching. A guy that I had initiated, he came to me, and he said, I killed the ego this morning. I said, what did you say? And this went back and forth like 10 times. And finally he got it. He goes, oh, the I that think it killed the ego is the ego itself, which means the ego didn't die. You got it. So the pathway to transcending the ego begins with the relationship with the guru. Again, paraphrasing Yogananda's words. That God was manifesting in and through Sri Yukteswar. And by Yogananda eventually listening to Sri Yukteswar, aligning himself with Sri Yukteswar, attuning himself with Sri Yukteswar's consciousness, it took him beyond the ego. I said this a few weeks ago, but it's worth saying again. Whenever we enter into a relationship with anybody, we merge with their karma, and their karma merges with us. That's why I always say, be very, very particular who your intimate friends are, and even be more particular with whom you are intimate with, because it's a merging of your karma. And I joked about this 2 weeks ago. You know, when I married Vicky, I merged with her karma. So her family's karma has merged with mine. Unfortunately, my family's karma has merged with her. I got the better end of the deal. The point is, though, is that to the degree that we develop our relationship with the guru, their karma, which is really no karma at all, it's pure divinity, becomes our karma. To the degree that we enter into them, surrender to them, we're not being subservient in the surrender. We are opening ourselves just as Yogananda opened himself to Sri Yukteswar, and we are elevated and elevated and elevated and elevated. Last Friday, I'll just give you a little example of this. There's a church, a Catholic church I go to for Holy Communion. And so I went to this church last Friday. They have a 12:10 Mass. And the priest there is very holy, very saint-like. And I was in a very kind of prayerful spirit, praying very intensely. The color for Krishna consciousness and Christ consciousness is blue. And this has happened before, but it hasn't happened in a long time. I was seeing blue everywhere around the altar. Going there in this prayerful spirit, in this open spirit, really attending to, just like Yogananda was at a different level. I was kind of taken temporarily into Christ consciousness, into Krishna consciousness. We become what we attend to. So we attend to the guru, we listen to the guru, we meditate, we discipline our lives. See how it works, and I'm working towards an end here. We do what the guru tells us to do, we organize our life, and what happens, it begins to tame the ego a little bit. And so at the first stage, it's like then the ego kind of becomes, a little bit friendly with the soul. And then over time, the ego just dissolves, until we are just in that state of consciousness permanently. So everything that the guru tells us to do, meditate, organize your life, follow the yamas and niyamas, follow the 10 commandments, those are basic exercises initially to tame the ego, so it's not running your life. And over time, the ego again becomes more and more porous, more and more transparent, until it disappears. And I'll close with this, because this is a really good example, and I think you can all relate to this. You all know who, I shouldn't assume this, who George Harrison is, one of the Beatles? Okay. I say I shouldn't assume this. I talked about this a few weeks ago. I went to a concert by Ringo Starr last month, and I went to my dry cleaners, and he's a young guy, 27, 28. He said, "What did you do, Mr. B?" It's what he calls me, over the weekend. I said, "I went to a Ringo Starr concert." And he said, "Who's Ringo Starr?" And I said, "The Beatles." "Yeah, I think I heard of them." Anyways, so this is a story about George Harrison, one of my favorite Beatle. And as some of you know, he was a very spiritual person. He loved Yogananda. And he had a guru who wasn't Yogananda, but knew Yogananda when Yogananda was alive. And he talked about Yogananda a lot. So his wife, Olivia, wrote a poetic memoir of his life. And this is what she says about his dying. And I'm sharing this because, although we don't have to wait until we die, but there's a letting go of, if we die in the right way, there's a letting go of the ego even before we leave the body, wherein we are completely free. But we don't have to wait to be on our deathbed to get there. But I want to read this because it captures an element of it. On his deathbed, fully conscious, George let go of everything. I saw George at the end, and he was incredibly beautiful and light, because the lightning is really the lightening of the load. The angst that he carried, the desires, the past, the future, they were all gone. He was just in the now, in pure joy, she says. And as he had not seen his son in a while, it was like his son came into the room, and she said it was as if he hadn't seen him in 1,000 years. The moment was so beautiful when his son came. The love that he had in his son just came pouring out without any egoic interference, like he hadn't seen him in 1,000 years. Think of somebody that you loved so deeply, you didn't see them in 1,000 years, and then you saw them. Imagine how your heart would sing. That's your soul. Utter joy. His death was like a birth, so pure, so simple, and so joyful. Self-realization. It happens in steps and in stages, but that's self-realization. The divine in me bows before the divine in each one of you.